Welcome to the Human Resources for Small Business podcast, presented by Xenium HR. I'm your host, Brandon Laws. Whether you're an HR professional or a small business leader, each episode of this podcast is designed to bring you the latest in technical HR and leadership at your convenience. More content is available on our website at www.xeniumhr.com. Let's dive into today's topic. Hey, welcome to today's show. I'm Brandon Laws. In today's episode, I have a conversation with Ed Muzio. He's the CEO of Group Harmonics and the author of the book Iterate, Run a Fast, Flexible, Focused Management Team. And as we know, change is oftentimes hard, especially for the larger businesses out there. But Ed describes an iterative organization as being one that has a really effective management team that could be fast, flexible, and absorb change as it happens. And he describes all the skills and the tools and other techniques that managers will need to be able to effectively iterate. So if you're having trouble adapting to change and iterating quickly and effectively as things around your organization are changing, this podcast is definitely going to be for you. And definitely check out the book. We cover a really high-level summary of the book, what it's all about, and Ed gives a lot of great tips. But I've read this book cover to cover. It is packed with lots of data, lots of charts, and a lot of things we really can't cover on an audio podcast. So I definitely encourage you to pick that up. Lucky for you, we're going to give away 2 books of Iterate. So all you need to do is tweet at us, tweet to your network, and tag Xenium HR. It's spelled XENIUM HR. That's the handle. And Ed's is at Ed Muzio. That's spelled EDMUZIO. And I'll also put those in the show notes as well, so you know who to tag in the post. So enjoy the episode. We got lots of great content coming your way. Thank you for all the support in 2018, and even prior to that, we've had a record-breaking amount of downloads in 2018, and I want to keep pushing. So one thing I wanted to mention is that we're going to get a lot more content, not only for HR professionals, it's definitely geared towards those as well, but we're also going to have a track that's geared towards senior leaders as well, because I know a lot of the HR folks, they're sharing it with their leaders as topics are timely and relevant to them. So we're going to identify when topics are relevant to HR people and ones for leaders as well. So more to come on that, but wanted to just kind of give you a little teaser that all that's coming in 2019. It's going to be an awesome year. Enjoy the episode. Hey, Ed, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Welcome.
Hi, Brandon. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So your book, Iterate, Run a Fast, Flexible, Focused Management Team. Fascinating book. In the book, you make the case that an effective organization is an iterative one. What do you mean? What does it mean to really be an iterative organization?
Well, first you have to kind of talk about the concept of iterating. And I always use the kind of silly example of walking across the parking lot to your car. So you walk out of a large building at the mall maybe, and you look at your watch and you need to get to your car in 3 minutes to stay on schedule, and you can't see your car and you think you know where it is, right? And so what do? You head out in the direction you think is best. And usually what happens is that's the most boring part of your day, right? So you get there. Now, what happens there is actually a little bit sophisticated, right? So you've got this executive office, that's your brain that's giving this command, right? Please get to the car in 3 minutes. You got your workforce, that's your feet that's carrying it out. But along the way, a lot of things can change, right? So your feet can deal with fluctuations in the surface, gravel or slippery or not. And they can do that without sort of quote unquote management approval, right? In the meantime, in your executive office, you're looking out over the horizon and you're seeing, oh, that's not my car, or there's an obstruction in my way. We need to change course. And you can do that with a minimum of shuffle. And, there's not a change management campaign that has to happen before you turn directions, right? Your feet are also using blood oxygen. That's a resource. And if they don't get enough, they can escalate to middle management for more. That's your cardiovascular system. And if middle management can't fulfill that itself, it can escalate all the way up to your brain, basically. And you'll get a message from your body that says, please breathe harder or walk slower or go to the gym more, right? So all of that's going on, and it's actually a lot that's happening. It's very boring to watch, but what's really happening is every time you take a step, you're gleaning information, right? You're learning about the surface. You're getting a little closer to where you thought your car was. You're seeing something clearer in the distance that's maybe an obstruction. And with every step you take, the information you get gets incorporated into your next step. And so if we take that over to the organization, we need the same thing to happen, right? You can sit down at the beginning of your year in January or whatever, and you can lay out a plan to where you want to go and how you think you're going to get there. But the truth is everything's changing constantly, right? So if you don't have a management team that's systematically reevaluating what we thought was going to happen in the future, what we now think will happen given our current course, and what adjustments we need to make to get our current course to align to where we want to be, then all the planning in the world in January is not going to help you with that. You've got to be able to adapt and adjust. That's basically what iterative management is about.
As an organization, if one is not an iterative organization as you describe it in the book, what does it take at the basic level to really start going down that path of being iterative and going through that process?
Well, I think before I answer that, let me say this. My suspicion is that most functioning organizations are doing this in some way anyway, right? So I think it's rare that an organization lays out a plan in January, follows it blindly all year, and still exists 2 or 3 years later, right? So I think there are aspects of this going on. I think probably what's fair to say is in many cases, it's being done on the backs of people doing the work in an inefficient way that makes life harder. And so I think if you want to get better at being an iterative organization, what you're really trying to do is to say, let's run an organization that actually reflects, acknowledges, and makes use of reality, as opposed to one that sort of pretends it has a plan and has ceremonial meetings about the plan, but then behind the scenes, everybody sort of runs around and makes things okay, right? So maybe one answer to that, it's a bit of a complex question, but one thing to start with is you can look at your meetings, look at the conversations, and you can ask yourself, to what extent are these meetings and conversations two things? A, are they about reality, right? Are we actually talking about what's changing and what we're going to do about it? Or are we sort of pretending that things are going according to plan? And then B, are they forward looking? Which is to say, are we sitting around saying, here's what we've done so far? Or are we sitting around saying, here is the current course that we think we're on, and here's how that's different from the course we need to be on, right? So if we're looking forward and looking for variance in the future, that's addressable. You and I, Brandon, can sit together and say, what should we do today about this thing that's going to be different in the future than we want? A lot harder for us to do anything useful if all we do is sit and talk about, here's how much I got done, how much did you get done, here's where we are, right?
Yeah. Ed, you had a really awesome graphic and illustration of what a iterative organization looks like, and you compared it to a heating and cooling system. Can you share how that's similar to what you're describing with the iterative organization and how a heating and cooling system works?
Yeah, sure. So that heating and cooling system is a funny one. People seem to really like it, and it's so simple.
I like it a lot.
It is, and I think it's a simple common experience, right? We all have one of those, and the important thing is a heating and cooling system is a feedback loop, and it is your thermostat that gives the feedback, right? So you've got this big machine in your roof that can crank out hot air or cold air, and you've got something you want to happen, which is a temperature. And so you set your thermostat at that temperature, and all your thermostat is doing is it's checking the room and saying, where are we relative to where we want to be? And then it's sending a command up to the machine to say, come on or don't come on, or blow hot or blow cold or whatever, right? So that piece is feedback. Now, feedback is sort of a dangerous word to use because we think about it in management terms as being sort of me telling you how you're doing if you're working for me. But this is a different thing. This is sort of an engineering definition of feedback, which is the system checks where it is and then uses feedback to adjust itself in the right direction. Take that over to the organization, and iteration requires feedback, right? On that walk to your car, you're looking ahead and saying, am I on the right direction? Is that my car or not? And feeding that back in, that's what's making the adjustments. In the temperature of the room, it's the thermostat doing it. In the organization, it's the management team. The management team controls all the resources in the company. They have a clear, or at least the clearest understanding of what the objectives and outcomes that we want are, what the organization wants to accomplish. And so it falls to management to be that feedback system, to be constantly saying, again, are we on or off course to hit the objectives we defined? And if we're off course, what will we adjust today so that the future we reach will look as much as possible like the future we want to reach? That's the feedback system. And it's different and distinct from giving feedback to an employee, for example.
It's so interesting. I love the metaphor of the thermostat, heating and cooling system versus the management team as the form of feedback loop. One is technology, and the other is people, right? So I imagine where things break down and where iteration becomes an issue in an organization is where communication stops within a management team, right? So how do you make sure your management team is really effective from a communication standpoint, making sure all the information, or at least the goals, are stated and that everybody's aligned? Because alignment is probably that key component to an effective management team.
Absolutely. I mean, and you put your finger on it, Brandon. I mean, I sort of debated and talked to some people and had some debates about whether I should include the management as the thermostat sort of story, because it does sort of fall apart, because you're right. I mean, the thermostat is so simple, right? The thing it's measuring is one thing. What's the temperature? There's no chance someone's going to get involved with that and have a different opinion about it, right? It's just so simplistic. And when we get into management, there's a couple things going on. One is the one you said, which is different people have different opinions, different ideas, right? People have trouble communicating. They have different agendas. The other thing is, actually, if you're talking about, an organization of more than, let's say, 20 people, different people are at different levels in the organization. So they legitimately have different information sets, and they legitimately have different agendas, meaning what they're trying to achieve at their level, right? So you have to get all of these people in coordination with each other. Obviously, there's a lot to that, but one of the key things is to start to bring that forward-looking information that I talked about, right? This idea that we're saying, where are we headed versus where we want to be headed, start to bring that into the meetings, make sure everybody is clear on the where do we want to be headed picture. And secondly, make sure people are clear on the how does that differ than the future we're now seeing. So there's a whole section in my book about kind of graphical data displays and things, because until you can do that, until you can put up a picture and say, as you know, everyone who works with me, Brandon and all my other peers and my boss, here's where I'm trying to go with my resources. Currently, I'm forecasting landing over here instead, which is different. Here's the reason for that. And here's what I think we should do about it, right? That whole thing that I just said, we call that an OSIR report, OSIR, objective, status, issue, recommendation. Objective, where I'm trying to go. Status, where I'm going to land instead. Issue, why it's different. Recommendation, what I think we should do, right? That whole thing has to take only a couple minutes, because you need the airtime in the meeting to actually have the conversation about what to do with the recommendation. And until you have those good displays, what happens in meetings, and you'll relate to this, I'm sure anyone who works will, is you have these meetings where there's like a whole lot of talking, right? So I'll talk for 10 minutes about how it's going, and you'll talk for 10 minutes about how it's going, and we're all having a conversation, but at the end of the hour, we didn't even get to a point of making a decision, right? So to get past that, you have to have some really good, clear outcomes, and also some good, clear graphs to help you kind of figure that out.
As a leader, a senior leader, when you're working with a management team, how do you make individual managers responsible for very specific graphical data that they could bring to a meeting? How do you coach teams on how to provide meaningful data that's going to basically streamline communication and get right to the point?
Well, it's, as you can imagine, a little bit complex, but one of the things that comes into play, so there's two issues. There's, first of all, how do you show your information? And there's the second, how do we bring you into the group and deal with it? So in how do you show your information, what turns out to matter is, more than anything else, there are three different types of output you can produce. You can produce routine output, like factory production, where they're all the same unit, or imagine yourself signing forms. I have to sign these forms. That's a very simple routine output. You can do troubleshooting, where the phone rings the problem, and then you answer the phone, and once you have the problem, you have to solve it. Or you can do project work. We all know what that is. That's something off in the future with milestones and checkpoints along the way. Once you figure out what type of output you're trying to do, which is a conversation between the manager and the employee, then you can start to look at, okay, here's a way of representing that. And there's some appendices in the book about that. But it's critically important to figure out what kind of output you're producing, because if you try and make a graph of counting how many things you made, and you're not doing routine work, it's not going to make any sense, right? If you're a guy that waits for the phone to ring and then fixes the problem you can't make that graph, because you don't even know what your work is yet, right? So you have to get pretty clear about that.
What role do that visual data, when you bring it to a meeting and you're basically displaying either productivity or meeting goals or not meeting goals, well, what do you really hope that decisions are made after that point? What comes out of that?
Well, what we really want is, we want everybody on the team. So let's say there's you and me and a couple of people who work for a boss. We want each of us on the team to have a small number of those graphs. So you can't be doing like a graph for everything. I have to be able to say, to my boss, hey, look, these are my 5 things I'm trying to deliver right now. They might not all be like exactly on the 1 year timeline. Maybe one's in 2 months and one's in 6 months or whatever. but I can sort of say week after week, this is what I'm heading my resources for. And it's not more than if we think about 7 things. So what that does is it lets you and everybody else in the team room sort of get used to it, right? So now you recognize what I'm doing. So when I put up a variant forecast and I say, hey, look, I'm going to be off, then there's this sort of recognition of that, right, pretty quickly. The other thing that has to happen is we have to build a set of expectations that says the sooner you detect a future variance, the better, right? So thank you for bringing in this variance early. Now that's at odds with a lot of what goes on in a lot of management cultures where you almost have people trying to sort of hide that, right? I'm going to say, I don't want to show them that I've got a problem. I'm going to try and fix it in my area. We certainly want people to fix things in their area if they can. But as soon as you believe, or let's take me, as soon as I believe that there's something that's going to happen in my future that's going to affect your work because, you're Brandon and you're my peer and you do something that sort of depends on my work because we're collaborating, the sooner I can bring that up, the better. Even if I bring it up and we all say, we don't think it's an issue yet, we still say, thanks, Ed, for bringing that to our attention early, instead of saying, why are you coming here with problems? Because that mentality, which is hide the problems, is, you can study the history of failed organizations and you will find, I think, in most cases, people hiding the problems, right? They just didn't want to bring it up. They couldn't bring it up. They weren't allowed to bring it up. We want all that brought in early on because information is power, right? The more information we have, the better we can act.
I imagine too, with that data, especially if you're bringing problems to light, people can rally around it, and it probably links the teams well. You talk a lot about linking teams, and I imagine not just within one function, but organizational wide, right? So if people are bought into either hitting goals or not hitting goals, they probably can shift really fast and figure out, okay, what do we need to do differently to achieve our goals, or to step on the gas, or whatever goals are out there. They probably can rally around it, and it probably brings all the teams together. What do you say about that?
That's right. You said it very well. And I think when I talk about linked teams, one of the key aspects of linked teams, each of the that's one of the 5 practices, and each of them has some detail behind it. One of the key aspects of linked teams is this idea that, okay, here's Ed with Ed's goals, here's Brandon with Brandon's goals, and we have a boss and maybe a couple peers. But the boss says to us, look, Ed, Brandon, peers, you've got your goals. You're responsible for your goals, but you are also, and more importantly, together responsible on this team with me for my goals, meaning what I, the boss, owe the rest of the organization is what we, my team, work to deliver. And so what that does, it says, look, Ed, you can't succeed if Brandon fails. Brandon, you can't succeed if Ed fails. We succeed or fail together. And so when I do bring that problem in, what you said exactly happens, which is, you and everybody else, if you dub that problem to be impactful to the higher level goals of our team, then we rally around that problem. And you'll say, well, how can I help? What can I offer? If you're not sure you should help, then our debate will be, hey, Ed, look, if I help you, that's going to affect this other part of the higher level goal. What are we going to do about that? But the whole focus is on the team producing its goals. And that's how we eliminate silos, right? Otherwise, we have Ed with Ed's goals and Brandon with Brandon's goals. And when Ed has a problem, Brandon says, well, I'm sorry you have a problem, but that shouldn't be my problem because I could fail too, right? And it's very reasonable if that's the way it's set up. But if you bring that upward looking success in, that goes away. And say, well, how do we rally around the higher level? Because that's what we on this team owe the organization.
Speaking of silos, so I don't remember if you talked about this in your book, but this is certainly not true of like blue collar organizations where they're producing something or manufacturing, because they're likely all within the same building. But in today's world, where a lot of things are digital, people work from home, management teams may be fragmented across the country or internationally. How do you link teams together when everybody's sort of fragmented and not together physically?
Well, I mean, you're talking about, I guess, maybe virtual meetings or whatever. And it's certainly, I'm not going to lie, it presents a challenge, right? I mean, humans work better in conjunction with each other in real life, right? There's a lot of nonverbals. There's a lot of facial expressions, information that's conveyed. That's pretty important. But conceptually, the tools are the tools, right? And it still works pretty well. Like, it still works a lot better for our boss to tell you and me, hey, you two are collaborating on my goals. You're not working on your own. You're collaborating on mine. Neither of you is successful if my goals fail. That will inspire, I think, us to get together in chat or by phone or whatever has to happen to kind of work on that. Now, is it easier if you're in person? Sure. But I don't think it's a requirement. And I think that I think what you're really doing is you're tapping into in the same way that virtual work sort of is a challenge because there's parts of our neurology that are looking for, let's say, visual cues and facial expressions. I think this issue of what do you mean by success, right? Your boss is defining success. And so when my boss says, Ed, get your goals done, and that's your success, then this reptile part of my brain comes online and says, okay, got to get the goals done. That's my path to survival, right? And so when Brandon comes in and says, Ed, I need your help, I go, I'm not doing it because I'm not going to break my success for you. But when the boss says to me, no, you and Brandon, all of you together, you succeed at my goals or not, all of a sudden I've said, that's the path for survival, right? So now it's almost, and I've seen this happen in iterative organizations. It's like, if you come to me and say, I have a problem, I'll say, I'm going to help you. And you'll say, I don't need your help. And I'll say, are you sure? You'll actually see people like almost pushing help on each other to say, I don't want us to fail. Let's make sure you're okay, right? So it's exact opposite of what you see in what I call traditional North American organizations, where it's like, no, I've got my stuff, you've got yours. Like, don't bother me with your problems, right? That's our boss's problem.
Ed, you probably would agree with me when I say most people run meetings very poorly, and they're not accomplishing what they probably need to in the end. So how do we run an effective meeting where, communication's in sync and goals are shared and you're starting that iterative process?
Well, meetings are painful and we sort of love to hate them, right? But all our work in management is done. I mean, if management exists to coordinate the organization, then our work is done in collaboration with each other. So we have to have meetings. So you have to sort of get over the idea that we can't have them, which is good. Once you get over that, you're right. Then how do we suffer less? There are some simple things like the agenda. Do we have an agenda? Do we know why we're here? What are we doing? If it's a management meeting, the agenda is sort of fixed in the sense of it's to check in. Are we on course or not? But you still need to have some information about, for example, if Ed's going to come present a problem, the team should know I'm going to present that problem because that way they can prepare for that conversation, right? So there's a couple more things like that, some tools around making sure people are contributing and they're not disengaged. Those things are important. The other thing to look for, though, and the place I usually start in when I'm consulting or coaching somebody, is listen for what's going on in the airtime. Here's some things that could be going on. You could have a small number of people either monopolizing the airtime through talking a lot or through asking questions, which is to say they keep asking questions, and so they're controlling all of what gets talked about. You can also have a whole lot of narrative information, right? So you can have Ed stand up and go, let me tell you how it's going in my area, and then talk for 10 or 12 minutes about that. It's very natural. But if instead what you want to hear in the airtime is you want to hear people making proposals and then people discussing those proposals in the context of higher level goals. So what you really want to hear is you want to hear Ed stand up and go, I have a problem. You know how to read my graph. Here's the issue. I think I should get some of Brandon's money to fix this problem. And then Brandon says, if you take that money from me, here's what the effect is of that. And then one of our peers says, well, you know what you could do. And so it's more sort of tentative. It's more like back and forth. There's more breaks in the conversation, and it's less people presenting from a position of authority in their area and more people sort of asking, questioning, and adjusting from a position of, hey, I understand my area, but how does my area affect your area, and how are we going to get there together? That's what you're kind of listening for, if that makes sense.
What are some of the risks associated with not being an iterative organization? I kind of look back at your example of the heating and cooling system, where if you don't have that thermostat and all of a sudden you have a really cold, snowy day or something, you're in your house,
you're free.
is extremely cold, so you're freezing, and there's nothing really you could do to make that shift. You don't have a thermostat, so it doesn't really recognize what temperature it is, right? So translate that to the organization, where an external force happens. If you're not an iterative organization, what happens? What are the risks associated with it?
Well, there was a famous quote. I hate to do this in a podcast because I may get it wrong, but there was a famous quote of, it was in the early days of Intel Corporation. I used to work there years ago in my career. They're one of my sort of influences, and they were certainly iterative. And there was a famous sort of secondhand quote conversation between someone at Intel and somebody at a competitor. And the competitor said, more or less, you can launch a new marketing campaign faster than I can get an airline ticket approved to go talk to somebody, right? That's the risk, right? The risk is, no matter how good your plan is, agility trumps planning, right? Agility beats planning every day of the week, every week of the year. So if you aren't able to adjust when something happens, then you're going to be wrong, right? Now, how wrong will you be? I don't know. How much will your people sort of take up the slack and work extra hours to kind of make it all okay in the background? I don't know. But even if that's going on, the thrust of the organization is misdirected, right? So we've got this plan we're all marching to. We know it's wrong, so we're trying to work in the background to kind of make it okay. how much more powerful is it to say, no, the plan's wrong now. It's okay. It was a good plan. Now it's not, right? Now things have changed. So let's adjust and take the whole push of the organization in the right direction instead of forcing our individuals to kind of sort things out on their own. It's a tax. And, if you get lucky, it's a small tax. If you get unlucky, it's a big tax, but it could be big enough to eat you if you're not careful.
Ed, I kept things pretty high level just because your book, I had a chance to read it cover to cover, by the way. It's packed with data, processes, lots of information that we couldn't even cover fully on the podcast. But before we part ways, I wanted to just ask you, is there anything specifically in this book that you want listeners to know before they really jump into the iterative organization model? And anything else that you'd want to talk about?
I think one concept that comes up early on that is a little bit granular but really important is I talk about management with a capital mint versus managing with a capital ing. We have a lack of vocabulary in this area. And usually when we talk about managers and we give managers advice, it's under the heading of what I call managing. So managing means, I've got an employee that works for me. Maybe that person's a manager, maybe they're not, but I've got to set goals and I've got to deal with compensation. I've got to keep them engaged. I've got to keep them motivated. I've got to support their development. That's all really, really important. And I don't mean to say it's not, but there's a whole other category of stuff I have to do as a manager, which is what I call management with a capital mint. And that is what we've been talking about, which is acting as the feedback system. And so what I'm finding is when I start to talk to people about this concept of iterative management, they sort of get almost distracted. They start talking about these important things about, motivating the workforce and about, figuring out proper compensation and market-based compensation and things. And all of that is not wrong. It's actually really important. But there's this other thing, which is if you as a manager and your fellow managers are not functioning in coordination with each other to constantly ask that important question, which is, given our current trajectory relative to our future goals, are they in line or not? And if not, how should we adjust today to change what happens tomorrow? If they're not asking that question as a group, if they're not answering that question as a group and making adjustments based upon those answers, then all of the managing in the world, while it may make your employees happier in the short term, is not going to make your organization successful in the long term. And by the way, employees like successful organizations, so it's not going to help you with retention or engagement either, as much as it could if you were actually functioning in your management role as well.
Ed Muzio, thank you so much for being part of the podcast. You're the author of Iterate, Run a Fast, Flexible, Focused Management Team. Where can people find the book or learn about you, or what other stuff do you want to point people to?
Well, the book's website is iteratenow.com, and there are some videos and resources there, including a video example of what it looks like when iterative management is happening. So that's a great place to start. My firm is Group Harmonics, so you can find me at groupharmonics.com. Both of those places have links to social media, things like that.
All right, thanks, Ed. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Brandon. Good to be here. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Human Resources for Small Business podcast. Subscribe to this podcast and leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, be sure to check out our blog at www.xeniumhr.com/blog and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn to hear about the latest in HR and leadership. The information on today's episode is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as legal or customized advice for you or your organization. This podcast is hosted and fully produced by Brandon Laws, that's me, and created and owned by Xenium Resources, Inc. For more information or to contact us, visit www.xeniumhr.com.